I'm so happy to see you all today. Thank you for joining us on this Friday, early Friday evening / late afternoon. I'm happy to have you joining us for the Graduate Student Caucus's next event. We're part of the Comic Studies Society, and this event is part of the professional development series that we host. Today's event is titled Comics in the Archive. Hopefully you all knew that. That's why you're here. And you're here to hype and talk about comics in the archives, how folks access archival material, and how those materials can be used to inform our work as scholars who work in comic studies. So at the Graduate Student Caucus, our mission is to support graduate students and early career scholars in the field of comic studies. And through our professional development series, we've had the pleasure of hosting a variety of really awesome events, from the recent teaching showcase, where participants explored innovative ways to teach comics and use them in the classroom, to our creative workshop with artist Ilia Maria Madrid, Close the Page, Create a Panel, where participants worked on and made comics as part of a community exercise. Today, we're going to talk about comics in the archive with two amazing speakers who have kindly agreed to share their experience and insights working in archival research and comics scholarship. They're going to talk about their experience locating, traveling to, and securing funding for their archival research, their methods for discovering and engaging with archival materials, and how their findings have informed their work in comic studies. We're going to start with Sydney Heifler. Sydney Heifler is a historian, artist, and comic book creator. She's a graduate of the MST in Women's Studies from the University of Oxford. She is a distinguished university fellow and a current PhD student of history in the history department at Ohio State University. As a historian, Sydney specializes in gender, sexuality, race, and media during the post-war period in America, with an emphasis on romance comic books and magazines. As an artist and a comic book creator, their work focuses on memoir, memory, graphic medicine, and art comics as activism. Her first article, Romance Comics, Dangerous Girls, and the Importance of Fathers, which was published in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, won the Comic Studies Society 2020 Article Prize. By the way, you still have an opportunity to submit for prizes. They're open today, y'all. If you want, you can always ask our esteemed presenters also about using their archival research in those kinds of venues as well. Sydney is also published on the Comics Grid, Journal of Comics Scholarship, MAI in Feminism and Visual Culture, and the comics anthology Won't Back Down. Her comic, How I Leave You, which was published on My Feminism, was shortlisted for the 2023 Graphic Medicine Award. A public-facing historian, they have also published on Panel by Panel, Comfort Food Comics, and Women Write About Comics. In all of her work, Sydney supports public-facing scholarship in digital history and humanities. So welcome, Sydney. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And then after Sydney's presentation, I'll introduce Dr. Adrienne Resha and her background before she gives her presentation as well. So let me get...
You're sharing the slides, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
That looks great. And I want to apologize in advance. I didn't have time to create a lot of slides. There was a bit of an emergency in the comics community that I am part of locally, and it took a bit of time away, but I'm excited to be here. I want to say, I think Adrienne also won 2 awards from our award cycle. And so, yeah, you should definitely submit. We've all had a good time with that. Okay, I have to read from my screen because for some reason my printer doesn't work because I desperately need it to, of course. So I'm going to set a timer so that I don't go over the limit. So I am Sydney Heifler, and I am a PhD student at The Ohio State University in the history department. And I'm a historian of gender, sexuality, and race in post-war America. And I primarily research romance comics and African-American romance magazines. I've worked on romance comics since community college, so it's been like 12 or 13 years or something crazy. And I've had a lot of different experiences about accessing my material for my research. 2 of my experiences have been in archives, which I'm going to talk about today, but I've also had some alternative ways that I've accessed my material and built my own archives. So if you have questions about that, I'd also be happy to answer that because I know sometimes that is necessary. So I've worked on romance comics published in the UK as well as in the United States after the end of World War II. And I will be talking about the two main archives I've worked in as a comic scholar, both the British Library and the Library of Congress. So you can go to the next slide. So during my undergraduate research, I actually didn't need to go to any archives. I had access to romance comics published during the 1950s online. There's a few online archives because they weren't copyrighted correctly. So they're all public domain. And I wasn't yet working on history of the 1960s and 1970s, which you do have to go to the archive for that or buy them because they are not public domain. And I attained two grants to purchase those materials. But the big archival trip I took was to my first one. The British Library was for my master's thesis, which focused on British romance comics. And I went about this completely backwards. I was taking some time between my undergraduate career and graduate school, and I was doing random internet searches about romance comics, and I discovered the British romance comics. And for some reason, that I can't quite remember, I went on the British Library's online catalog and I did random keyword searches for romance comics. And the results were actually pretty unclear, but I became convinced that these romance publications I saw were romance comics because of little clues I found on online blogs and forums. So I highly recommend playing around on the internet to discover research questions and interests. And so I thought, well, I want to go see if these are some comics that people aren't writing about, because there were other British romance comics that came later that people have written about and are currently researching. So I thought, well, I should get a master's degree in the process. And I applied to 3 master's degrees in programs in the UK, and I got into all of them. And I chose Oxford because I thought, one, it would be a lot of fun. I wanted to do a bit more in women and gender studies because my undergraduate was in history, and I wanted to broaden the way that I could approach my research material. And also, Oxford had very easy access to the British Library because there's bus lines that go to London from Oxford that are very cheap for students, and there's trains, and then you can access the underground system and get to the British Library very easily. So I went there, and the online system for the British Library is great. It worked really well, and I just had to do, they had like very clear instructions about how to call your material and about how long they would hold it for you. And the most complicated process of working with that material was having to go through all the boxes to find the comics versus the magazines. And so I was very lucky. There were a lot of British romance comics in those boxes, like I thought there was going to be. And the process of working with them was that I had to decide how I wanted to arrange my master's thesis, which I decided I wanted to go with the comic first and do a very deep reading of them, and then look at the secondary source material to explain what I was finding. And I couldn't take the comics home with me, obviously, which I wasn't used to. I was used to being able to access the comics whenever I wanted to. So the way that I went about sort of cataloging this material for myself so I could use it easily later was I created an Excel spreadsheet where I put the title and all the publisher information in one cell on the spreadsheet. And then I did a very thorough write-up of the plot line with like page numbers and everything so I could cite it very easily later. And then in another cell, I would put like the thoughts I had and the important themes I wanted to bring up. And then I would take scans or pictures of the panels and pages I wanted to make sure to remember to describe accurately or include in my, like physically in my thesis. And it worked out extremely well. I didn't have to apply for any fellowships because I was already in England, but I did have to take out a student loan for my master's degree. So it was much more expensive than going the other way about it. But I got my master's degree, and it was really great. And within that library, I didn't have to worry about food because there was a cafe that was really easy to access and affordable. So it was a very easy first archival experience. And so, yeah, so that was that experience. And you can move to the slide 2 now. Okay, so the other big trip I did was to the Library of Congress, and it was sort of a more classic story about archival research work. Um, I wanted to research the Writers' War Board and its intersection with romance publications and romance comics. And so this would be for the first chapter of my dissertation. And I've been thinking about this topic since my undergraduate days and had written as much as I could about that point without going to the archive itself. And I didn't have to research about the fellowships because I was part of the comics listserv and they send out a reminder about the Swan Fellowship through that. And so I finally like lined up where I could apply for it and it worked where I was in the graduate program. And I did a full application and I sent it to my advisor for feedback, and it worked out pretty easily. There's very thorough instructions about how to do it, and I really fit perfectly with what I needed for my research at the time. So that worked really well. But I also, and you should do this, I applied for matching department funds. So if you have access for that, make sure you do it. Every summer, my department has a competitive funding application for summer research. And so I applied for matching funds and I got it. And for this trip, I had to do much more research in terms of budget and how to access the archive. And it was made complicated by the fact that I have a physical disability now that I didn't have before. And that limits the amount of time I can sit in a chair. So I had to budget for more time that I would have had before my disability. And so luckily no one contested to this. And I had to look for more long-term stay hotels that had a kitchen and laundry facilities and that had easy access to the archive so that I could get to it and not exacerbate the disability. And just to add another thing about disability and research, I'm also pretty blind. So when I apply for funding for areas that don't have adequate public transportation, I have to ask for more money sometimes because I have to stay in hotels that are closer to the archive, so I can't drive. And my university tries to make people drive instead of fly because it's cheaper. So I have to make sure to put in my application that, like, you can't make me rent a car. I cannot drive. And so just make sure to advocate for yourself when you're doing these applications because it's important. Now, before I went to the archive, I had to make sure to put in request for material, and it was not as straightforward as the British Library, which kind of surprised me. And I did that online, and they have librarians you can reach out to ask questions. And then because I had a fellowship, I had like 3 people assigned to me that were supposed to show me how to access the material, which somehow made it more complicated because they all had very different feedback. So I just kind of chose a person to talk to, and they walked me through the steps. And then when I arrived there were 2 more people that were supposed to give me a tour. And it was much more complicated in terms of accessing things like food while I was there. And, but once you get established at the Library of Congress, it's much more easy to recall your material. And the librarians and archivists there are very great to talk to. And I also reached out to some people who had done research in the archive before me, and they gave me great resources. And the articles that I read on the topic for it, I looked at their footnotes and what boxes they were pulling so I could know either which boxes to avoid or to call, because they don't always have great descriptions in the archive lists, because all the archives have archive lists of what's in each box, and it's not always clear, but it helps to build off the research to look at the footnotes of the research that you're building off of to see what they're drawing for their arguments. And the particular archive I was looking at, the Writers' War Board, is a very messy archive. I think what happened was when they were pulling the documents from the actual like files of the organization, they just pulled them as is and did not reorganize it. And one scholar before me had taken some time to organize it, and then I had to go through and take some time to organize it as I was going through. And it was like it's apparently very known for this. So just prepare that not all archives are organized. And then for the comic book research part of that, I had another archivist that I worked for who specialized in comics, and it was in a different room. And she was very great and made it very easy to call it material and to point me towards scans. But I had to make a schedule of when each archivist was available because they all had different schedules. So it can be a very messy process to do this research and to sort of fit the puzzle pieces together of who you're working with and which rooms you're going to be in. So if you go to a huge library like the Library of Congress, I would take some time to familiarize yourself with that process and really reach out to people ahead of time. And and then I just want to take a note to talk about um, sort of creating your own archive. Like, make sure to look out for grants that you can sort of create your own archive, or to look out for grants that aren't necessarily about comics, but that relate to the other part of your research. So for me, that would be like post-war and gender studies, and so I could apply for a grant for that to go look at these comics. And yeah, and that kind of wraps up my talk. And I think I'm at time. I'm almost at 12 minutes, and I want to give plenty of time to Adrienne for her section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney. I love that you talked a little bit about like creating your own archive and finding ways to kind of build the materials that you need for yourself when they don't already exist as a whole. I'd love to talk some more about that in our
For
Q&A.
sure. I'm very passionate about that.
Yeah. Okay, so our next speaker is the incredible Dr. Adrienne Resha, who is a rising scholar postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian representation and racialization in American popular culture, especially in the superhero genre. Her first book, Arab and Muslim Marvels, combines cultural history of the genre and critical analysis of visual media featuring post 9/11 and post Arab Spring superheroes. She won a Lucy Shelton Caswell Research Award in support of this work, which is something I'm sure she'll talk a lot more about here with us in just a moment. So welcome, Dr. Resha. Let me get your slides pulled up.
As Sydney very generously pointed out, and I always forget to leave this out of my bio, I've also won other awards for this stuff. I've won the Hillary Shute Award, which it is my obligation as a CSS board member to tell you that you all who are here live, not necessarily the people who are watching this later on YouTube, that our awards deadline for this cycle was extended to next week. So I would definitely encourage you to submit for the Shute Award. That can be an unpublished piece of any graduate scholarship that you're working on. There's also the dissertation prize, which requires a letter of rec. But you can submit to that within a larger window. We also offer a leadership prize through the generosity of Frederick Louis Aldama, for BIPOC emerging scholars, as well as a number of other things if you're published or if you're at different stages. So keep an eye out on that stuff. It's open to non-members, so you don't have to be a member of CSS. But there's lots of ways to get awards for what you're doing. And we want to encourage graduate students to be doing comic studies work. So yeah, I'm Adrienne. As Morgan read from my bio, I work on mostly Arab and Muslim superheroes, including Simon Baz. And when I started doing my research, I started my PhD program in 2017, and I wrote my prospectus in March. I defended in March of 2020. So I had written that in such a way as to do all of my research through a virtual archive that I had on Comixology. And I thought that that would be enough, that I didn't have to travel, that there was a pandemic going on, and I didn't need to actually be anywhere. And the joke was on me because as I got further and further into this work, and particularly this work on Green Lanterns, I realized I had to go see it in person. And part of that is because I was working with not just virtual digital comics, but also with these reproductions of Golden Age Green Lantern comics, which are digitally recolored. And if you've ever seen those, you've probably heard people complain about them. They are not accurately reproduced because they're not produced on newsprint, and I can talk way more about that. But I'm going to show you some pictures of newsprint, and we'll talk about that as I go. So I will go to the next slide. So this is straight from the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum's website, which is at OSU, and I know a bunch of you are at OSU, so you're not eligible for it. But this is a very generous award named after Lucy Shelton Caswell, who is the editor emerita of Inks, the Journal of the Comic Studies Society, and who's just been a major force for women in comic studies. And this award is up to $2,500, supporting anyone who lives without a certain outside of a certain geographic range of the Billy Ireland. that can be used to defray travel expenses, living expenses, or research costs. And so for me, this was largely travel and housing while I was there. I stayed with Sydney for a little bit, and I also stayed in a hotel. But it's open to anyone. It's not just open to grad students. It's open to non-OSU graduate students, faculty, independent scholars. So you don't actually have to have a PhD to go do this, or you don't have to have one yet. And again, you have to be that more than 60 miles from the main campus. And as part of this criteria, I had to write a letter, which again, Sydney was very helpful with and read, saying why I wanted to go there and be there and do that work there. And if Morgan, you could go to the next slide. So they do this every year. Applications open up in the fall. You have that statement not exceeding 2 pages describing the research, which for me was describing a chapter of my dissertation, and which will then become a chapter of my book project and also has an article in the works. We'll see. And then you have to have your CV and a letter of recommendation. And this is where I really want to, I'm so just absolutely grateful for my graduate advisor, Arthur Knight at William and Mary, who absolutely championed my work. And I know that for a fact because not only did I get this award, he also nominated me for a dissertation prize that I won at my school. And I just want to say it is so important if you're just starting out or at any stage to have an advisor who is going to be in your corner and support you and support this kind of work and write those letters for you. Because it makes a huge difference to have someone who is willing to, show up for you. So I knew about this award because I've been in comic studies circles for a while now. I've been attending CSS since 2018, which was the first conference that they had. So I don't even actually know how I learned about it. It was just kind of in the air. And I decided to apply for it when I realized as I was working on this stuff that I needed to go see actual comics, and I told them that. And so this again, it opens up in the fall. It gets announced usually in January or February, and you have a calendar year to go. It's a very generous prize. Columbus is a great place to go visit because there's a great transit system. The university is very centrally located. There were plenty of places for me to go eat, and I was able to sustain myself for the 2 weeks that I was there without having a car, which, as Sydney mentioned, is really important if you cannot travel with one, which is difficult to do. So next slide. I knew that the Billy Ireland had this huge collection, right? And it's sometimes difficult with archives to figure out what they actually have. So I went to the Billy Ireland's records on their website and I did a reverse search of Green Lantern, and I had it go chronologically from the oldest comics to the newest comics. And I created this spreadsheet on Google Sheets that is chronologically organized. And it's even longer than what you're seeing on screen, but this was what was easiest to convey without making it too small. But I picked out the title. If I had the authors, I had the authors there, the location in the library, the call number, the year, and the catalog. So I would copy and paste the URL. And I compiled this and then I color coded it with everything that was white with stuff that I absolutely wanted, like absolutely had to see. And then the different colors of cyan, magenta, and yellow, which relate to color printing. Because I am nothing if not a fan of puns, that would convey different levels of importance for if I could get a hold of this stuff, it would be really great. But also if we couldn't get it done in the time, then that was fine. This would have just been extra. Because the Billy Ireland did offer a sort of guide to how to request things, and I reinterpret it into this spreadsheet and I emailed it to them, and it made it much, much easier to go through everything. They pulled everything that I needed from this and put it on a cart for me while I was there. And they also pulled other stuff. Susan Liberator in particular, again, to shout someone out, would find things that I didn't know I needed, but I absolutely did need. And I'll show some pictures as we keep going. But if you go to the next slide. So that first spreadsheet became this spreadsheet. So as I was actually going through these comics, they're still listed chronologically. They still have a lot of that other information. But I had the second form of it where I was locating not just where it was, but where I had taken pictures of it and what age of comics it came from. So they're color coded again. But then if you see on the far right, there are dates. And so each of those dates coordinates to a Google folder for pictures so that I could figure out when I took pictures of what. So that when I went back through my own personal digital archive of these pictures, it made it much easier and still makes it much easier to find things when I need to look for them. And so having this, and then this also made it much easier when I had to tell them what I had looked at. I had this very detailed guide. Sometimes I would put links in there for notes to figure out what I had talked about. Sometimes I read things out of order. There's the official Marvel tryout book in there that I didn't know about when I got there, but when it was provided to me, I was able to find stuff about coloring. Um, and this whole question arose of like, I was looking at Green Lanterns and I was looking at how they were printed, but I was specifically looking for how they printed skin tones. And Green Lantern is a particularly rich text to do that with because there are, from the 1940s to the present, a number of different Green Lanterns of a number of different racial identities. And so you can chart the progression of not just the narrative, but also the technology. So even though I clocked like 200 comics, I did not sit there and read every single one of these, but I did sit there and take pictures of all of them. So it was a very interesting experience of I wasn't actually there to read things like Sydney was. I was there to look at how they were printed and to take lots of pictures with my phone and to be able to take those back so that I could then go and work on it. And think about how comics printing has changed since the 1940s, along with the ways that the narratives about race have changed and our ability to produce race on these things. So if you go to the next slide. So yeah, this is what my albums ended up looking like. You can see how they're dated. You can also see from these thumbnails that Google just provided that I was taking pictures of people's faces often and zooming in and looking at the ways that dots were printed. By the time I left the Billy Ireland, everybody was seeing dots because I had spent so much time talking about it. And I still think about them all the time when I'm working. So it was a lot, but I have more pictures. So next slide. This was one of the things that I didn't know was there, but that again, Susan Liberator was very kind to provide. One of the terms that I had learned as I was doing this work was color guide, and a color guide is what the colorist makes. So when an artist makes a full page, then they shrink it, the colorist applies colors to it, and then they will apply codes to it before it gets sent to the printer, where a separator will create the plates that actually end up printing it. And so I was able to look at this particular color guide from a newspaper comic, but that was more or less representative of the kinds of technologies that I was looking at, and see how Superman's skin tone was colored, to see how Wonder Woman's skin tone was colored, and to think about how this would translate from this process, which is the coloring process, to the separations process and the printing process, which I've been very careful to make distinct when I talk about it, because there's not a ton of scholarship on this. So a lot of this was me learning what all of this stuff was from scratch and learning from looking. So if you go to the next slide. This was from an issue of Marvel Age, How to Color Comics the Marvel Way, which is something I'd actually seen circulating online and then got to see in person. And this is not a great color chart by any means, but it does give you an idea of how color gets printed in comics. And I think if you click twice, I think there's an effect, but I might be wrong because I can't remember. I've given so many versions. Nope. Uh, Try clicking forward. Yeah. So the color guide gave you an idea of how it's printed. So that 25R and 25Y on Superman's face, it looks like a peachy pink in this comic, right? But when it actually gets printed, it's a combination of magenta and yellow dots that provide an illusion on newsprint of what skin tone would look like. And if you go to the next slide. That's what it would have looked like. And so from a distance, this looks like a white skin tone, but up close, you can see the material process of how skin tone was colored. And that would have been visible to the naked eye if you just looked closely. But I also spent a lot of time hovering over things with my phone and zooming in as much as I could to get those more distinct pictures. And so this is Alan Scott, who was the first Green Lantern. This is a comic from 1941, which is as close as I could get to his debut year. And one of the problems that I ran into while studying him in particular is that when he debuts alongside Asian characters whose skin tone looks from the reproductions like it's the same color as his hair. And so that's what led to me having to go to this archive and look at this archive and see how skin tones were printed, because it wasn't enough to just see how they were colored in the reproductions. If you go to the next slide. So this is the color chart. This might have the effects that I wanted earlier. If you click, yep, there we go. So that one circled 25 red and the 25Y, that's what the white skin tone is. And then on the right, go back. You see on the right lower hand chart, that's what brown is. And that's the color that would have been recommended both for brown hair and for the color of Black character skin tones. So if you go to the next slide. And click twice. So you can see looking at this comic, which is from the debut of Jon Stewart in 1971, that Jon's skin tone matches Hal Jordan's hair. That the comics were not very good at producing browns, and so when they did produce brown, it was the same brown, which is also why we have white characters with the same white skin tone, because there were only so many colors that they could print. This is not just because partly because of the technology, but partly because there wasn't a greater will to advance the technology, because we do know it's also capable of printing a greater variety of skin tones. If you go to the next slide and keep going, because some of these I teach with these, so I always forget what I have in here. And so that brings me up to more digital coloring. On the left is a Green Lantern from 1994. That's the Comixology edition versus the print edition, where you can see that now the colors are much more in line with the line work, that they are much more clearly printed than they have been historically, and that it's now possible that the two characters on this page don't have the same skin tone, even though they both appear to be white men, although Kyle Rayner is later retconned as being a Latino character. Next slide. So and you zoom in, you can still see the dots in the 1990s, sorry. You can still see those dots, but you can also see a different range of colors that are presented in a different style and much more clean lines. They are much better at printing by this point. Next slide. And next. And click again. And again. So this gets me into digital coloring, which is where I started. So this is from a comic in which Simon Baz appears, but you also see the range of Green Lanterns who appeared before him, from Hal Jordan to Guy Gardner to Jon Stewart to Kyle Rayner. I know all of their names, and it doesn't ever get easier to say them. And so looking at when you have this recommendation for what a white skin tone should look like versus what a brown skin tone should look like in a digital comic, which is from the DC Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics, I was looking at how when going from traditional printing to this more digital coloring, which still uses the CMYK, the cyan, magenta, yellow inks, but has this digital technology, which should produce a greater range of skin tones, but does not necessarily mean that people are always thinking about how that works behind the scenes. And if you go to the next slide. And so I'm interested particularly in Simon Baz for this, because Simon Baz is, like myself, Lebanese American, but conveys a certain way of how it looks to be Arab, and does not necessarily convey the actual diversity of what it means to look Arab, and where that falls between this kind of racial binary that's constructed in comics because of the ways that we've presented skin tone over time. So next slide. And then I look at specifically the Green Lanterns comics that juxtapose Simon Baz with Jessica Cruz, with an Arab character and a Latina character, and how across these comics, Simon is always depicted as darker than Jessica. Next slide. Even when the artist changes and the art style changes and the colorist changes, that there are these differences between them that I then went on to interrogate in this dissertation chapter, which again won the Hillary Shute Award and has been recognized with other stuff, and has been, something that I've become very passionate about and thinking about color and color production, because of this archival work that I got to do, and because of not just this digital archive that I have, but also the print archives that I'm very lucky to have been able to work with at the Billy Ireland. I think the next slide's the last one. Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Resha. Appreciate all of that, those amazing images. So we have a little time now to just have some conversation about the things that our wonderful presenters have talked about, questions you have about the practical nature of looking through an archive, or thoughts or questions you have about what it means to use an archive as a comics researcher. Any questions at all that you have, I'd welcome them either in the chat. You're also welcome to just turn on your audio and ask questions.
I have
So,
one.
yes, Camden, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Dr. Risha, I have a question for you, because I visited the Billy Ireland one time for my final project to get into grad school, an essay that never even got finished because my advisor said I did enough for it. But one of the things I did is I interviewed Brian Walker, and he told me the story, and I have it on audio, of how they found the Green Lantern number 76 art in the archives. Did you see that?
I did see some of the original art too, which
Yeah.
I have pictures of. Yeah, it's really interesting to see that stuff when it's blown up right and it's
Yeah.
without the color and all that stuff. So yeah, I have seen some of the original art too.
he told me a whole story about how they found those because that was in Mort Walker's his dad's museum that he ran, and he told me a whole story about how they found those in the Billy Island while digging through boxes and boxes. The other thing he saw was the Snowbirds Don't Fly cover, I think.
I feel like I might have also seen it, but I can't remember. But I looked at so many comics. I think one of the things that's really that I like I think that is good to remind everybody of is that this stuff isn't like lost in the archive. It's just sometimes misplaced. And
Yeah,
when we do like I'm never finding something, I'm never discovering something that the archivist doesn't know at some level is there. But yeah, it's especially the Billy Ireland has absorbed other collections, so sometimes they don't know at first exactly what they have. So there are some real treasure troves in there.
that's what I did. I wrote an essay mainly on Bill Blackbeard's thing because that was when they had those 18 semi trucks of just newsprint, and I'm like, well, and my school paid for me to go to the Billy Island, so
Yeah, it's a great place. And I know Sydney's worked there too because she's at OSU. So it's and I know Morgan has and Katie and there's all sorts of people here who have been there too. It's a great archive.
I think part of what Camden's bringing up too, which I think is really fascinating, is this idea of how archives work as an institution, right? How they're absorbing personal collections, how they're actively seeking some collections. I'm wondering if you all would talk a little bit about your thoughts on this tension between this like institutionalized archives and what it means to take people's kind of personal material items and experiences into the institution where you have to travel and access them in a kind of exclusive way, as opposed to like kind of the personal, more grassroots or community oriented nature of these. I'm thinking more of like zine archives or,
Mhm.
personal museums and collections. Would you all talk a little bit about that?
Adrienne, would you like to go first?
I can. I think so. There's definitely like a utility to having an institution that has funding and that has the means to protect and preserve things, right? I also worked in special collections at William and Mary before I graduated, and we had just gotten a comics collection when I got there, and it was specifically a comics collection that was dealing with African American representation. And William and Mary is a predominantly white institution, so there's a certain amount of like, well, what does that mean to take in something like this, right? And what does it mean to, share it with people and to properly archive it and to properly contextualize it? Which is part of why I was there. And why I was interested in it. And I did a little exhibit with it that's on my website. So there's definitely like the Billy Ireland has a fantastic amount of resources. They do a lot of fundraising. They have, the special protections for all of this stuff, but they also can't absorb everything. So there's a certain tension there too of like, what do we determine? Like, how do we determine what has value that we should maintain, right? Like comics, and especially the kind of comics that I write about, and I think Sydney too. The earlier stuff was not determined to have any value really when it came out. Like, there's a reason it's so hard to find some issues. Why I can't personally see the first time that Alan Scott appeared in a comic is because that's kept somewhere in someone's house in a vault because it's worth a lot of money. I think that stuff should be in archives, but there's a certain like it is, that tension certainly exists that Morgan said between like, is this keeping something away from people or is it preserving it or what does it mean to do that? And so as often as possible, for us to, use these archives and prove that they have this value, right? That when the Billy Ireland goes back and makes its report at the end of the year, it'll say, well, we supported these two or however many scholars with this award, that they did this work, that it means the stuff is worth keeping, right? But it's also in a certain way inaccessible. I would not have been able to go without that funding. And I didn't have the same kind of matching funds. I had a little bit of support from my home institution, but it's something that I needed that support from the Billy Ireland to get there. Versus like, and that's being in Virginia, which is not like a centrally located to a lot of comic studies stuff. VCU has a great collection, but it's much harder to go through because it's not as well organized. I've said that to them, so I feel like I can say that on video. So yeah, there's definitely I was like, I can't figure out your website and it's really stressing me out. Because it's huge. It's a great collection, but I had to go in and ask and they brought me out issues one by one, whereas the Billy Ireland trusted me to like handle my own stuff. So it was a much different experience. And you'll get different experiences at different archives depending on who's there. So yeah, I think there's a certain amount of like tension between like what does it mean to have like these kinds of works versus what does it mean to have a community archive, which I think Cindy can probably speak more to as a creator.
Thank you. You're making me laugh because the Writers Warbird collection is the least organized collection, And the archivists know it, and they kind of wait for you to panic. Like they watch you go through it day by day, and they're like, "How's it going?" I'm like, it's not going well. And so I didn't get a read. Like I was trying to read through the Writers' Reward material, and I could not I had to just scan, and I wanted to bring up that the iPhone app, the Notes app, is great for scanning. It has automatic OCR, and so it's pretty useful for scanning documents that are text-based, not necessarily comics. But yeah, so in terms of like this tension between institutions and like being a person that's trying to, because I think as a disabled like queer woman in academia, like I feel like I exist in two planes as like this privileged academic, but also someone who faces a lot of issues. So I feel that tension is just a person trying to act. Like sometimes I feel super privileged one day and super like not the other, and that's like hard to grapple with. And I try to be honest in that kind of way when I approach my access to these materials. And going to the Library of Congress with that fellowship made me like in a very good place to access materials there, because there's so many researchers that go in that archive, right? And just to the Library of Congress. So I had special help because of my fellowship, and that made it very easy. I think it would have been a lot harder to access that material and just like figure out my way in the archive without that fellowship. And I was frustrated that these materials weren't made more accessible, because there are some previous researchers who I'm not going to name who, because they can access the material easier, have used that material in, I feel, unethical ways because of the ways they've quoted the material incorrectly to make certain arguments. So I feel like when you make it accessible to privileged people, a lot of white men, like the first statements, it can cause violence and interpretation. And I think it should be made more accessible to minorities who don't always have the same access to funding because they're not important white men. And but I don't know. And then I have the issue of trying to access African American romance magazines when there are not a lot of archives about that. So I've applied for grants and created my own personal creation of those. But as a white woman, I don't want to hold on to that resource forever. So I've made arrangements with another librarian, to once I've got my book in contract, to donate that material so that other scholars can access it easily. So I think there's a lot of ethics and morality when it comes to this archive building, and it's in the Billy Ireland is great because it is a bit more accessible, and they make a lot of efforts to be active in their local community. Like they're involved in Cartoons Crossroads Columbus, which I'm on the programming committee for, and they make sure to highlight, like they've let me for 4 years now organize a grad student panel where I can prioritize highlighting what grad students are doing, and they're constantly doing talks about the curators, and they respect the artists, and they respect the fans, and they respect the communities. And some places you don't get that respect, and I think that makes a difference. In the Library of Congress, they did, and the Library of Congress, the British Library, they had no idea what was in those boxes. Like there are some romance publications, I guess, and I was like, just like no one knows what's in these boxes. Like no one cared to know that there were romance comics in there, and they didn't care what I did with them, and they just did not care about these comics, and that was very surprising to me. But within the community, I think it's great to like make friends with people in the broader comics community who are creators, who are fans, who do respect this material in a different way, and it can enrich your knowledge. And then they also share resources with you. Like I've had a couple of people send me their like entire romance comics collections to use for my research because they like that I'm honoring the material. So I think that also shows up when you're a scholar who really cares about the material and cares about respecting in your scholarship and sharing it with the community. I think I got a little sidetracked. I'm sorry.
No, I don't think you got sidetracked at all. I am really interested in like all of these questions that you all are kind of raising and interrogating, because I feel like so much of what archival work does, especially with a form or a medium like comics that has not historically been preserved in really rigid or rigorous ways, that when we engage with the archive and we write about the archive and we publish about the archive and the things that we're finding, and we just use them and cite them, we're creating these material traces, right? And they're traces to people, they're traces to historical moments, they're traces to lots of other kinds of contexts. And that includes, as you're saying, Sydney, like all of the kind of people who normally don't show up in like academic spaces, but also all of these amazing materials that have these kind of amazing histories, kind of the way that Adrienne's talking about this like print history that is intertwined with representations of race and ethnicity and the narratives that happen in comics with that. So as we think about kind of encouraging all the folks on this call to engage with archives, to think through archives, for me, when I first started doing archival research, I was really intimidated. I was intimidated by the database. I was intimidated by going into the physical room and touching stuff. I was intimidated by asking questions. Where do I even start? What am I even looking for? And so I was wondering if you all would kind of talk about what kind of advice you would give to someone who would start being interested in kind of taking a step toward archival research, or maybe is early and kind of learning about how to use these different systems and this as a practice. What kind of advice would you give them as a way to start or a place to start?
Adrienne, were you about to jump on? I don't want to cut you off. I don't know. So I think it's important to remember that you love your research and you're doing it for a reason, right? And there's excitement in that. And so you should remember that there's a lot of fun in doing this. And that always helps me recenter myself when I get anxious, because I wasn't really nervous about the British Library. I don't know what was happening there. I don't know why I was like, I'm going to go get a master's and not know for sure if there's something in the archive I can use. That was a very confident younger version of Sydney. But with the Library of Congress, I was extremely nervous and I was anxious, and I just had to like really talk with people and ask them a million times, like, are you sure this is how I call the material? Because it was a very confusing, complicated system. And then talk to your support system, and remember the good work you do, and you're here for a reason. And it's exciting. And the comic studies is a great place to challenge the system, I think, as Adrienne and I have talked about through this. And so I just say, just remember why you love the research. And it's okay. It's also really okay to be freaked out. Like, it's okay to be scared when you're going into these archives. And I was really nervous my first 2 days at the archive. And then you are just like, know that after the first 2 days, it's going to get easier. And that anxiety is sometimes something that we cannot get rid of. And you just have to sit in it, which is not fun, but.
I think my big thing would be to ask questions and ask for help specifically. I'm I don't I like I one of the things I think is really difficult about being in grad school is that you sometimes get discouraged from asking questions of other people. Like you're encouraged all this time to like ask questions in your work and to try to answer those questions, but it sometimes becomes intimidating to be in a room full of really smart people who all seem to know exactly what they're doing and what's going on. And I think even like sometimes hearing from Cindy, like it sounds like we know exactly what we're doing, right? But that's because we've been doing it for a long time now. Like we're
Adrienne always
old.
sounds super smart.
Thank you. I do. I know this now. When I started my PhD program, I would not have been able to accept that compliment. Like it's because I didn't always feel smart, but I did always ask questions. And like I have made this a point with my students to be like, you're there and you're in this place, and there are people who are working there whose job it is to answer your questions and to help you. So like in talking to Susan Liberator again about my research, she was able to find things that I wouldn't have been able to find in the records by myself. To be able to ask questions about like, oh, I want like I have this specific thing, but I don't know how to find it, and they would find it. And then to be like, how does this thing work? How does the like how what can I do for you to make this easier? What do you need from me? Just all sorts of questions that I had on top of my research questions, and like understanding that it is someone's job, much like it's my job in the classroom to answer my students' questions, it's someone's job to answer my questions when I'm in an archive. And you should definitely take advantage of their expertise because they live there, not live there literally, but like they're there more often than you are, right? Uh, so I think asking questions is my like piece of advice that I would give to anyone in almost any context. And to not like, I don't know, it is kind of scary sometimes, right? Because you're asking something of someone that requires not just their expertise, but their time and their care and all of these sorts of things that are about being a person that are sometimes difficult, especially under the conditions that we've had to do some of this work in. So, but I think also it's their job. Like, let them do their job and help you.
Yeah, and speaking to that, I had like one archivist who was kind of not helpful. So there was more like I went to a different librarian, like archivist. So it's okay to like be like, I don't like to choose your archivist, because it sounds like Adrienne found someone who was particularly helpful. And so it's find your person. And then you mentioned the harsh conditions. And so another thing about making sure that you have a good experience in the archive is to make sure you're taking care of yourself. So like make sure you're eating and that you're getting up from the chair and walking, and then like do some yoga. Like take care of your mind and your body, because the archive, even though it's fun and exciting, can be really harsh on the body, and that does affect your experience in the archive. And then Adrienne's talk on the physical print of the comics made me think about the importance of also looking at material that isn't perfectly preserved, because I feel like a lot of archives like to collect really pristine collections of things. But when I buy a used romance comic like that's low grade on eBay, it's usually some girl's comic where she made notes and she like really enjoyed that comic, and you can see more how the reader uses it. And I think that's really important for research. It's important to really engage with the material and not just, I think comic space can push us to look at materials in sort of a collector perspective where I want that really nice copy, and make sure to like look for opportunities to look at more used material.
I want that really clean copy because I don't care about what the reader did with
Wait,
it. I want to see the
yeah,
page. But
you want to
like
look at the print.
there's definitely people like there's people who do paratext who study the ads in comics. Like the reproductions don't typically have ads, but these archives do is a really big important thing. That I just like don't like I have tunnel vision. I do not care about whatever else is going on. I'm just looking at the thing. But like there's obviously value into not doing that. And I will say, Susan Liberator, not only will I shout her out as often as possible, she's like in my dissertation acknowledgments. Like that's how much that's how important that 2 weeks with her was like that she's immortalized. And I had to give them a copy. So like I have a print copy of my dissertation and they're thanked in it. The Billie Ireland, because I was contractually obligated, but I also would have done that anyway. And they also now have a copy that they have to catalog. So because I had to give them a piece of my research when I did it. So it's also very cool to have a piece of my scholarship there with the stuff that I worked on.
That's so great. I love you all talking about kind of the joys and the excitements, but also at the same time, like, yeah, you forget that you're a body and you're like, have I gone to the bathroom? But you feel like you don't have enough time. So you're like, I'll just sit here. It's fine. It's fine. And then you leave at the end of the day and you're like, I'm so dehydrated and tired and hungry. So taking care of your body while also experiencing those joys. I love to hear about that. So maybe as my final question before we wrap up for the evening, speaking of the joys and the excitements, can you all tell us maybe just one thing that you found in the archive that made you feel excited or just like compelled in a very extreme way? Like, what was the top find in the archives?
That's such a hard question when you've looked at like several hundred things, right? Like they're all deeply precious to me. Uh, I don't know if any of you have one that hops out.
I have one from each archive. Um, for the British romance comics one, I was really excited to find things that kind of marked it as different than an American romance comic. And there was this story that I found where the woman gets killed by that I know that doesn't sound exciting. The woman gets killed by a bunch of elephants running her over at the circus for misbehaving, and that was a sort of a consequence you saw in those comics that you didn't see in American, like for bad behavior on the part of a woman that you didn't see in American romance comics. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is so different. And my advisor at Oxford also thought it was a really funny, like weird find. And then and like to see the like level of violence enacted on women in British romance comics compared to American romance comics. And then in the Library of Congress, there was a letter from the creator of Superman to the Writers' War Board of being like, hey, I just made a comic and I'm like the first one who's actually a comics creator to make a comic supporting the war that's also fighting in the war. So like, and you should pay attention to me kind of thing. And I thought that was like amazing. There was just a letter and then not like, and it had an old paperclip on them. They did not care about it. Like, and so it was really exciting to hold that, to see that like the comics people actually cared about the war and it wasn't just like two separate entities of the comics people and Writers' World Board. And I was really fun to find that letter.
Was that from the creators of Superman and not Captain America? Because I feel like Captain America, this is me like
No,
fully Captain America got involved in the war first.
I know, I know. Jack Kirby was definitely involved in the war too, but no, it was the super. And then he said he made like the army version of Superman, and then there was a comic there. And then a lot of like just seeing the comic book people like desperately trying to support the war effort. It was also exciting. Like, it's so exciting to read an article that someone wrote about the archive you're going to, and then going and seeing like how they interacted with the material versus how you want to, and seeing how the field can grow and how you as a scholar can like make it grow.
In terms of people writing about their archival experience, a number of the Lucy Shelton Caswell winners have written for the blog for the Billie Ireland. So I have a blog post about what I did there that includes some of the stuff that I think I mentioned today, as do other recent winners and people who were there or overlapped with me. I think I'm for right now, maybe not all time, but I think my favorite thing are those the Adrienne Roy color guides. Partly because it's kind of delightful to find someone who has your name and like when you have an absurd spelling like I do. But also because it was like we there's often this idea, and not from among comic scholars, but there's this idea that comics were men's work and that they were always being made by men. And so her existing in there and being named is really important. But also all of the stuff that I do is a reclamation of women's history because often women were doing the separations. I can't ever give them the full credit, but I can talk about the fact that they did it. And so then seeing someone like Adrienne Roy's work where she was doing colors and she was responsible for a lot of the colors in other DC comics and giving us a lot of the ways that we understand DC characters, I think particularly Batman, through her color work. And it's this very hands-on way to say, well, no, it's not just like this recent thing of girls getting into comics, and it's not just, it's not just like, Miss Marvel, which I work on, and that's why I got into comics, but it's like we've been here the whole time. And so I think it's really special to see that, and then to see something that was just so illuminating for me to be able to interact with, because it gave me a way to think about what I had been reading about with color guides, but also just coloring generally.
Adrienne, I have some comic color guides. I'll try to find them, but like I found them on eBay. But I'll, if you want, I can send them.
I have, when I got home from my trip, I went on eBay and I actually have a Green Lantern color guide that I bought for but like those things weren't preserved. They weren't understood to have
No.
value. So it's like something like it's a collector's thing now. And I think I maybe bought it for $30 on eBay.
Yeah.
And it's mostly pink because I was like delighted to find a Green Lantern page that had no yellow and no cyan on it. I'll have to dig it up, but it was I got this thing because I've been thinking about it and doing it, and like finding one that was from an issue that I saw in person, but like that nobody thought meant anything, but that now means a lot to me, and that also should be preserved. So if anyone's watching this later and you have color guides, please send them to a library for me personally.
Well, as we close up, thank you so very much, Sydney Heifler, Dr. Adrienne Resha, for sharing with us this afternoon, for giving us some insight into your experiences. Before we officially log off, I just want to ask, where can people find you? What are you hyped about doing next? How can people follow you?
I think I'm on Blue Sky with a public account. It's my name at whatever the Blue Sky thing is. I think if you Google it, it's fine. I'm also working on my first book, so hopefully there will be some stuff about that soon. And I gave you all my email. I'm at UVA through next year at least. So please feel free to reach out.
And you also have a website, don't you? With your
Oh, I do have a website. Yeah. That's also true.
Yeah.
I haven't updated it in like 6 months, but it's myname.com. So you can also reach out to me there. Thank you, Sydney.
You're welcome. So I have a website. It's also just sydneyheifler.com, and it lists like my publications and things like that if you want to follow up on my research. I'm also on Blue Sky, which I think is just my name, and it's sort of my academic account. And if you want to see like really cool just romance comics, I have an Instagram account that's just romance comic books, and I post like ridiculous panels from romance comics for viewing pleasure. And then I will be at OSU for probably 2 more years working on my dissertation about romance. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. A round of applause for you all. And be on the lookout for more events from the Graduate Student Caucus of the Comic Studies Society. You can check out our website, which has had a wonderful revamp from our wonderful web editor. So stay tuned for more from the GSC.